Hello everyone, my name is TUMNAD, and in today's video we are going to be looking at what we call the gray matter and then what we call the white matter. If it is your very first time to watch me, please make sure you subscribe, you put on the notification bell so that whenever I load the video, you become the very first person to watch. Let's go ahead and get started and look at what we call the gray matter and what we call the white matter, okay? So now we are going to be meeting these common terms during the study of the neurophysiology, the gray matter and white matter. We need to understand what gray matter is and then white matter is. But what we need to know is that gray matter is going to be the collection of neuron cell bodies within the central nervous system. Okay, primarily within the central nervous system. That's going to be what we call the gray matter. Okay, and then when we talk of the white matter, these are going to be like the bundles or the axon bundles which are myelinated. Okay, those bundles which are myelinated, they appear white. Okay, meaning that the white matter is going to be all those bundles which are going to be myelinated. Okay, so now we need to first understand the whole of this structure such that we see where do we find the gray matter within the central nervous system and where do we find the white matter within the central nervous system. Okay, so now this is going to be now like the brain cerebrum. So now this is going to be like the cerebrum, okay, and this is going to be the midbrain. This is going to be the pollicis. This is going to be the medulla oblongata, and then this is going to be what we call the spinal cord, and then of course we're going to be having what we call the cerebellum. Okay, so now here we have tried to zoom in out to bring in the cross section of the spinal cord, such that we are able to see exactly where the gray matter is going to be located within the spinal cord, and then where do we find the white matter within the spinal cord. That's why we have tried to zoom in out in one of the regions of the spinal cord. Okay. So now when we talk of this, of what we call the gray matter, now in the cerebrum we have this kind of the gray matter which is going to be located on the peripherals. Okay, these neuron cell bodies which are going to be residing on the peripherals. So now that kind of the gray matter which is coating the cerebrum, we simply call it the cerebral cortex. Okay, we simply call it the cerebral cortex. Okay, and then we also have such kind of the gray matter which is going to be like more bit deeper within the cerebrum, in the base of the cerebrum, located within the deeper areas with surrounding axons. How do we call that kind of the gray matter? That one is what we call the basal nuclei. And of course, you're going to be having a lot of them, like the puntamen, the caudate nucleus, and even what we call the globus pallidus. Okay, so now these ones are going to be like the nuclei which are going to be residing in the deeper areas of the cerebrum, and even also some part of what we call the brainstem. Okay, so now we also have these bundles of axons which are myelinated, which are going to be connecting like the two hemispheres. We have that kind of the white matter which is going to be connecting the two hemispheres. Okay, like for example the right and then the left hemisphere. So now this kind of the white matter, this band of myelinated axons, they are what we call the commissurals. Okay, they are what we call commissura. Okay, and then the classic example of the commissural fibers is what we call the corpus callosum. Okay, is what we call the corpus callosum. So these fibers of the white matter are going to be connecting the two cerebral hemispheres. Okay, then we also have such kind of white matter fibers, those kind of the axon fibers, which are going to be connecting the frontal lobe to the occipital lobe. Okay, they are not going to be connected the right and then the left hemispheres. They are going to be in independent hemisphere, connecting or sending messages from the frontal cortex or then to the occipital cortex. They are not going to be crossing. So now how do we call those bundles of the axons which are going to be helping in the communication between the frontal areas to the occipital areas? Those ones are what we call, you see like these ones which are a bit red, they are going to be in independent hemisphere. They are not going to be making communication between the hemispheres. It is on independent hemisphere. So now these kind of the white matter, they are simply called association fibers. Okay, they are simply called association association fibers. Okay, they are going to be helping in the communication between the frontal areas of the hemispheres with the occipitals. They are not going to be aiding in the communication between the two hemispheres. The fibers which are helping in the communication between two hemispheres is what we call the commissural fibers, and the classic example we said corpus callosum. Okay. Then we also have these fibers which are going to be moving the information from the cerebral cortex, and they move all the way down to the spinal cord. You see these fibers, and even also going to be having some other fibers that are going to be picking sensations, and they take this kind of information up to the cerebral cortex for the process of integration and processing. So now we're going to be having these fibers within the spinal cord. So now how do we call those fibers, those axon fibers within the spinal cord? They are going to be moving up and down. They are simply called the tract. Okay, they are simply called the tract. But now we have these axon fibers which are going to be moving up, meaning that they are picking the sensations and they are taking it up the cerebral cortex. How do we call that kind of up movement of this kind of the tract? It is just simply called ascending tract. Okay, it is simply called ascending. It is simply what we call ascending tract. Okay, ascending tract. And because it is taking the sensations from the lower areas to the upper areas for processing, they are going to be more of sensory. Okay, they are going to be more of sensory. Okay, they're going to be more of sensory. So we have ascending tract, which is going to be carrying sensory information. And then of course this descending, these are which are going to be moving down, carrying messages from the cerebral cortex down to the spinal cord. Of course they're going to be carrying a response, and the response which is going to be motor. Okay, so now these kind of the axons which are descending axons, they are going to be, they are what we call descending tract, and is going to be carrying motor. It's going to be carrying motor response. Okay, it is also such another beautiful thing, meaning that in the spinal cord you're going to be having the ascending tract, which is sensory, and then the descending tract, which is going to be motor. So now this kind of the ascending and the descending tracts, which when they reach into what we call the brain stem, we're going to be having more of what we call decussation or crossing over. Okay, the motor fibers which are going to be crossing, and then also the sensory, and then also the sensory fibers which are going to be crossing. So now we are going to be crossing within the brain stem, and they make this kind of the network of the crossings within the gray matter of what we call the brain stem. So now how do we call this kind of the network which is going to be due to the crossing of the sensory and then motor axon fibers, creating this kind of a mesh? This is what we call reticular formation. Okay, this is what we call reticular formation, meaning that you're going to be having now some other big pieces of the gray matter. You see these pieces of the gray matter? This is what we call the nuclei. That is why you're going to be having a lot of the nuclei within the brain stem. Okay, we have the nuclei for all the cranial nerves within the brain stem, from cranial nerve number 3 up to 12. So now this kind of the reticular formation is going to be making a lot of the different pieces of the gray matter, which we call the nuclei. It is also such another beautiful thing which we call the reticular formation. So now when we come to the cerebellum, we also have these kind of neuron cell bodies which are going to be residing on the peripherals, on the outer layers of the cerebellum. So now this is just simply called the cerebellar cortex. Okay, this is going to what we call the cerebellar cortex. And then of course in the inner areas, in the inner layer of the cerebellum, we're also going to be having what we call myelinated axons, which we call the white matter. And the classic example is what we call the arbor vitae. Okay, it is also such another beautiful thing. So now having seen all the diagrammatic illustration in this one, so now when we come to this kind of the cross section of the spinal cord, we are going to be seeing that we have the white matter, and then also have what we call the gray matter. You see now this kind of the H-shaped structure, which is going to be in the middle of the cross section of the spinal cord. This is going to be what we call the gray matter, and of course going to be having the posterior horns or the dorsal horns, and even what we call the ventral horns. And even also we should not forget that we are going to, in some areas like from T1 up to L2, we are going to be having what we call the lateral horns. Okay, and then of course we're going to be having what we call the white matter, which is going to be on what we call the dorsal comb, then the lateral horns, and then even also what we call the ventral columns. That's where you're going to be having the different types of what we call the white matter. And of course, this white matter are going to be having the axon fibers, which are going to be moving up and then also moving down. For the case of the dorsal column, we only have ascending tracts. Okay, we only have ascending tracts. But for the case of the lateral columns and then the ventral columns, we have both ascending and then descending tracts. It is also such another beautiful thing to know. Okay. So now, having seen all that, let us now see the difference between the gray matter and then white matter, following all these kind of what we call the objectives. So now, starting with the definition, what is going to be the gray matter? We just simply said that gray matter is going to be a group. It's going to be a group of neuron cell bodies. Okay, it's just going to be a group of neuron cell bodies in the central nervous system. That's just going to be a brief definition of what we call the gray matter. And when we talk of the white matter, it is simply a bundle. Okay, it is simply a bundle of myelinated axons. Okay, a bundle of myelinated axons in the central nervous system. Because a bundle of myelinated axons within the peripheral nervous system is what we call a nerve. Okay, is what we call a nerve. But a bundle of myelinated axons within the central nervous system is what we call a white matter. Okay, so now how about the color of these two structures? Because it is having the neuron cell bodies, it is going to appear gray. Okay, it's just going to appear. It's going to appear gray. And because it is containing a bundle of myelinated axons, it is just going to appear white. Okay, that white kind of the myelin thick makes these kind of the axons to appear white. So now, if it is appearing gray, what are those components that make it appear gray? The first one is what we call cell bodies. Okay, is what we call the cell bodies. The second one is what we call the dendrites. Okay, is what we call the dendrites. Another one is what we call unmyelinated and myelinated axons. Okay, you may even find some other people including what we call the synapses. Okay, what we call the synapses. So now these components make the gray matter to look gray. And then of course when we come to the components which make the white matter to look white, just simply because of myelinated axons. Okay, it is just the myelinated axons which makes it to appear white. Okay, that fatty sheath which is going to be produced by the oligodendrocyte for the case of central nervous system, and then Schwann cells for the case of peripheral nervous system. This is such another beautiful thing. Okay. So now we need to also look at what we call the location of the gray matter within the central nervous system, and even also the location of the white matter within the central nervous system. Now, looking at the location of the gray matter within the central nervous system, particularly the brain, we are going to be finding the gray matter within the following areas. Within the brain, we said the whole of these outer areas of the gray matter, we said is what we call the cortex. So now, in the outer area, we are going to be finding what we call the cortex. Okay, and then even also in the inner, okay, in the inner areas, we shall also be finding, we said that you have also this kind of the gray matter which is going to be residing in the deeper areas, and we said that this one is going to be what we call the nuclei. So now again, the gray matter within the spinal cord, we said they are going to be finding the gray matter within the spinal cord in this kind of this arrangement which we call the H shape. Okay, it's going to be found in what we call this kind of the H shape. Okay, H-shaped structure, which is going to be centrally located. Okay, which is going to be centrally located, meaning that the gray matter within the spinal cord is going to be in the center, which we call this H kind of the structure. So now coming to what we call the white matter with location within the brain. Now within the brain, you're going to be finding the gray matter in the inner layer. Okay, in the inner layer. So now you're going to be finding bundles of myelinated axons within the center of what we call the brain. Okay, this is such another beautiful thing. So now when we come to the white matter location within the spinal cord, it's going to be located in the outer areas. Okay, it's going to be located in the outer layer, in the outer layer of what we call the spinal cord. Okay, so now that's going to be now the location of the white matter within the brain, in the inner deeper layers, and then even also in the spinal cord within the outer layers of the spinal cord. So now let us look at what we call the main function is going to be played by the white matter, and even also what's going to be played by what we call the gray matter. The main function of the gray matter is going to be what we call integration. Okay, what we call integration. Okay, integration, and even also what we call processing. Okay, what we call integration and then processing. So now the information is going to be coming to the gray matter for processing and then integration. So now when we come to the white matter, because they are myelinated axons, they are going to be aiding in what we call impulse conduction. Okay, what we call impulses conduction. Okay, impulses conduction, what we call the transmission of what we call the action potentials. That's going to be the main function of what we call the white matter. It's just such another beautiful thing. Okay, so now let us be comparing the gray matter and the white matter by examples. So now when we come to the examples of the gray matter within the brain, we said we have the following. We say this kind of the gray matter, which is going to be located on the peripherals of the cerebrum. We say it's what we call the cerebral cortex. Okay, we say it's what we call the cerebral cortex. Okay, and then we say that we also have this kind of the gray matter, which is going to be on the outer layer of the cerebellum. We simply called it the cerebellar cortex. Okay, we simply called it the cerebellar cortex. Okay, and then we also said that we also have this kind of the gray matter, which is going to be residing in the deeper areas of what we call the cerebrum, and we called it what we call the basal nucleus. So now we also have what we call the basal nucleus, and of course with the basal nucleus, you're going to be having some other gray matter, which we call the putamen, and then even also what we call the caudate nucleus. Okay, so now let us look at now the gray matter, which is going to be residing within the spinal cord. And of course, when we talk about the gray matter in the spinal cord, it's going to be located in this kind of this H kind of this structure. Okay, so now how do we call the different areas of this structure, which we are calling the gray matter within the spinal cord? So now this area is going to be the posterior end, and then this side is going to be the anterior side. So now how do we call these kind of these structures which are going to be making this H shape? So now these ones here are what we call the dorsal horns. So now a classic example of the gray matter within the spinal cord is going to be what we call the dorsal horn. Okay, the dorsal horn. And then these ones here, which are going to be located anterior, they are just simply called the ventral horn. Okay, they are simply called the ventral horns. And then we also have what we call the lateral horns. Okay, but these lateral horns, they are going to be residing in specific areas within the spinal cord, primarily from T1 up to what we call L2. Okay, but they are just called lateral horns. Okay, lateral horns. But primarily they are going to be from what we call T1 up to what we call L2. In some other regions, you may not see this kind of the lateral horns. This is such another beautiful thing. So now the white matter within the brain, we have these classic examples. We said we have these kind of myelinated bundles of axons, which are going to be connecting the two cerebral hemispheres, and we called it what we call the commissural fibers. And the classic example of that one is what we call the corpus callosum. So now we have what we call the commissural fibers, and the classic example is what we call corpus callosum. Okay, corpus callosum. This was one of the classic examples of the white matter within the brain. Okay, and then we said that we also have those kind of the fibers which are going to be connecting the anterior part or the frontal lobe, and then they send messages to the occipital, making the communication between the frontal areas and then also the occipital areas. We said they are not going to be crossing from one hemisphere to another. They are working on independent hemisphere. We said that those ones are what we call association fibers. Okay, association fibers. And then we also have what we call the internal capsule. Internal capsule. Okay, internal capsule. And of course, with internal capsules, we are going to be having a very big bundle of fibers that are going to be helping in the communication between the upper centers and then also what we call the lower centers. And the classic example of this one, you may even find it being called projection fibers. Okay, projection fibers. Okay, it is just such another beautiful thing. Okay, so now how about the white matter within the spinal cord? The white matter within the spinal cord, when we see the whole of this area, these are going to be the areas of white matter within the spinal cord. The lateral areas, the dorsal areas, and even also the ventral areas. Okay, so now how do we call this area of the white matter? This is what we call the dorsal column. Okay, it's simply what we call the dorsal column. Okay, the dorsal column. Okay, and these ones here, they are what we call the lateral columns. Okay, they are what we call the lateral columns. Okay, and then this one here in front, they are what we call the ventral column. Okay, they are what we call the ventral column. Okay, they are what we call the ventral column. Okay, again, another classic example of the white matter within the spinal cord, we have these fibers. Okay, these fibers, the one which are moving up the ascending tracts and then even also the descending tract. So now another classic example of the white matter within the spinal cord is going to be what we call the tracts. Okay, what we call the tracts. Okay, what we call the tracts. And of course, the tracts, we are going to be having the ascending and even also what we call the descending tracts, because they are all going to be white matter within the spinal cord. You're going to be having the dorsal column, the lateral column, the ventral column, and then the tracts which are going to be ascending and then descending tracts. Okay. So now again, talking about in line with what we call disease going to be affecting the white matter and then the gray matter. So now if you have a damage to what we call the gray matter, it's going to be affecting more of what we call the thinking. Okay, the thinking, and we're going to be having conditions like Alzheimer's disease. Okay, it's going to be one of the diseases of the gray matter. And when we come to the diseases of the white matter, you'll find that we have some other diseases which are going to be affecting transmissions, like what we call multiple sclerosis. Okay, so now if you have the disease of the white matter, you're going to be interfering with what we call communication between one area of the brain to the other. Okay, it is also such another beautiful thing. Okay, so now this briefly covers the gray matter and then white matter. Let's have just a very quick recap of what we have just said. We said that the definition of the gray matter is going to be the group of neuron cell bodies in the central nervous system. Okay, and then we have said that the white matter is going to be the bundle of myelinated axons in the central nervous system. If you have a bundle of myelinated axons in the peripheral nervous system, that qualifies to be a nerve. Okay, and then we said that the gray matter is going to be gray, and then of course white matter is going to be white. It is white because of the myelinated axons, and then the gray matter is gray because of the cell bodies, dendrites, myelinated axon, and even some also what we call the synapses and some of the glial cells. Okay, some of the glial cells. Okay, and then we said that the location of the white matter within the brain is going to be in the inner layer of what we call the cerebrum, and then within the spinal cord is going to be residing in the outer layer of the spinal cord within what we call the funiculi. Okay, and when we talk about the location of the gray matter within the brain, we're going to be having it in the outer one, which is going to be what we call the cortex, and then the one which are going to be in the inner areas where they're going to be having the axon fibers passing aside of them is what we call the nucleus. And we said that this kind of the nuclei which are going to be on the base of the cerebrum, they are simply called the basal nuclei. Okay. And then also said that the main function of the gray matter is going to be processing and then integration, while the main function of the white matter is going to be mainly conduction of action potential, which you call the impulses. And then we said that the examples of the gray matter within the brain, you're going to be having the cerebral cortex, you're going to be having the cerebellar cortex, and then even also what we call the basal nuclei. Okay, and then we said with the gray matter within the spinal cord, you're going to be having what we call the dorsal horns, the lateral horns, and then even what we call the ventral horns. Okay, and then we said that the lateral horns, they are going to be only for the case of T1 up to L2. Okay, and then we said that the examples of the white matter within the brain, they're going to be having the commissural fibers, which are going to be connecting the two cerebral hemispheres, and the classic example is what we call the corpus callosum. We said that we also have what we call the accession fibers that are going to be helping in the movement of messages between the frontal areas and then also the back or the occipital areas. And then we said that we also have what we call the internal capsule, which are going to be the projection fibers. We also have what we call the white matter within the spinal cord, whereby you're going to be having the ascending and then the descending tracts. We also have what we call the dorsal column, the lateral columns, and even also what we call the ventral column. They are also called the funiculi, the lateral funiculi, the dorsal funiculi, and even what we call the ventral funiculi. Okay. This briefly covers gray matter and white matter. And if you think whatever I've talked is making sense, is adding to you, you're benefiting, please, you can like the video, comment down in the comment section, and subscribe. Thank you very much for watching TUMNAD, as always, until we meet next time.